Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. In this programme, we're discussing ways in which tenant farmers can take advantage of natural capital income streams, as well as addressing some of the barriers and challenges to market entry. This is the ninth episode in our series, Filling the Funding Gap, in which we discuss how natural capital markets can help farmers transition towards resilient and regenerative food production. I'm joined by George Dunn, Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association, and by Lucy Jenner, a Director at Savills and head of their natural capital consultancy. Welcome both. George, can I start with you? How can tenants take advantage of natural capital opportunities?
Hi, Finlo. Thanks for bringing me on today. Great to be part of this podcast. I think the first thing to say about tenant farmers and natural capital is that if you look at tenancy agreements, and particularly the old style tenancy agreements, I think they were actually the original natural capital agreements, because when you read through them, you see issues around management of hedgerows, management of trees and woodlands, management of soils, grasslands, ponds, watercourses, all that stuff is in those agreements. So for generations, tenant farmers have been, in my view, at the forefront of managing natural capital and doing the right thing by it. But in my day-to-day dealings with tenant farmers, they certainly understand the rhythms of the natural environment and how they play in harmony with the agricultural land use. And they want to do the right thing by delivering for both their businesses and for the wider environment. But
Um,
in, sorry,
no, carry on, George.
but in terms of the monetization of natural capital, which we're clearly now seeing, we have hit a few snags and a few issues. Now, obviously, we have the public schemes, including things like the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which has just recently been closed to new applications for the time being, countryside stewardship in England. And in Wales, we've got Glasstier, the Habitat Scheme, and the forthcoming Sustainable Farming Scheme in Wales. And we need to ensure that tenant farmers have the necessary security of tenure to deliver those schemes over the term of their agreements, and also that where necessary, the landlord's consent is provided and it isn't unreasonably withheld or delayed. And in the private schemes, we're into even trickier territory, those emerging private markets for natural capital, because routinely, and I'm sure Lucy will have something to say about this, we see landlords wanting to capitalize on those markets themselves. But we are beginning to see some changes where landlords, particularly some of the institutional landlords, are seeing the need to work collaboratively and collegiately with tenant farmers to deliver those benefits. So I think there's a great opportunity for tenants to be involved in this, so long as we have those good relationships.
And Lucy, are you aware of particular natural capital opportunities that lend themselves specifically for tenant farmers?
Yeah, thanks, Finlo. And really interesting thoughts to sort of kick us off, George. There's several points that I want to make in terms of this question. So natural capital, particularly in terms of financing from the private market and the voluntary private market, has really emerged at a landscape scale. And so that's why we've sort of seen these projects get going on these sort of big private estates where maybe it's a single owner or a group of trustees, and it's uncomplicated in many ways. But I really want to stress the point that landscape scale can apply to farms too. And I'm not just talking about big farms, I'm talking about farmers working together. And we've got a lot of examples of this. So I think there's quite an exciting potential in this cluster model. So just to give a few examples, the Landscape Enterprise Networks, this is an initiative set out by Three Keel a few years ago. They cluster buyers and sellers with a geographic focus. So they've got one going in Yorkshire, for example. Nestle and Diageo are supporting farmers in their supply chain, and the farmers are sort of aggregated by representatives, and it's that cluster model. So they're able to deliver landscape scale, natural capital, and nature restoration, but across multiple different holdings. And we're doing a similar project with a group of farmers in the Pentland Hills, to south of Edinburgh, where I am today, where they're coming together and creating something that is many thousands of hectares across many different farms. So I think I want to push back a little bit against what we hear a lot, that finances are just looking for that landscape scale. They are, but you can achieve that at a farm level too. And then just a couple of extra thoughts on that question. So There are some possible new codes. So the hedgerow carbon code, for example, I think could be something that is really well suited to a farmed environment. And I know that's under development with the GWCT at the moment. But then thinking along those sort of that sort of scale, what else can you do on a farm? Well, riparian planting, so along watercourses, wildlife corridors. So again, in the Pentlands, they're doing a thing called greening the clues, and that's basically the sort of connecting valleys. They're bringing woodland back there. So it works alongside the farming system. You've got natural lines that are occurring, and there's opportunities in there as well. So I think maybe requires a bit of creativity, but there's definitely a lot of opportunity.
Looking at the Pentland Hills, is it that there is a kind of a landscape scale scheme there, and one source of income for that nature recovery, or are there lots of different sources of income within that scheme that are being paid to different farmers for different reasons?
So yeah, the farming cluster at the Pentlands is a really fantastic, innovative group of people, and it might be worth having them on the podcast at some point. They've got a lot of interesting experience to share, but you're quite right that it's all about diversified income streams and de-risking their farming businesses. It's very much a working landscape. It's going to stay a working landscape. It has a lot of pressure from visitor numbers, the farming system, that they recognize that it could be more environmentally friendly. So they are looking at all sorts of different schemes from peatland restoration, woodland creation, riparian planting, and many others across a number of different funding models. So it might be private investment, it might be carbon offsetting, it might be a public scheme. And we've been supported so far through Nature Scott's facility for investment ready nature, which is a public fund here in Scotland, to really try and kickstart the project. We're engaging with local businesses to try and get private support for local nature restoration on working farms. And the reception has been fantastic. It really appeals to people that it's a group of farmers leading this. And I think that USP is something that should not be forgotten for other farmers looking at doing this kind of thing.
So in terms of that, is there sort of a vision that that the landscape recovery team is sort of working towards, and then within that, individual farmers are able to say, well, we're particularly interested in soil carbon, so we're going to try and monetize that. Is there an income stream there for that? Or is it that there are a number of income streams and individual farmers are able to access or stack them together depending on how they're working their land?
A bit of both. So, I mean, fundamentally, as you'll know, a lot of it depends on, your base starting point has to be what can the land actually do? So what ecologically is viable, and then what within my farming system is acceptable and suitable and is going to, enable me to keep farming. So it might be soil carbon, it might be more of a grassland type project, it might be peatland restoration, it just depends on what you've got. The idea is very much to get to stacked income streams. But again, as you'll know, there's just a bit of questions around that at the moment in terms of additionality and making sure that you don't accidentally make yourself not available for a particular scheme because you've done something else. So that just needs a lot of careful thinking through. But the idea is that, as I said, it will be a sort of diversified income portfolio for the farms, that they can, maybe do a bit of tourism, do the farming as the fundamental, have income from nature restoration as well. So we're trying to stack all those things together to ultimately deliver their vision of it being an integrated landscape where it's, as I said, a working landscape. Farming is at the core of it, but nature has been brought back. People are able to enjoy it in an accessible way, and it's nicer for everyone as an environment.
And just the last question on that, and sorry that you probably feel like you're being drilled on this particular scheme, but it's I'm wondering about whether you're aware of tenant farmers versus landowner farmers within that scheme, and whether there are opportunities for both.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are opportunities for both, because the model that they've set up is to try and take everyone on the journey. So they're very much all learning together, and they've created a separate legal entity for this model. So it's something that everybody can get involved in. And I mean, of course, as George said, it is trickier for tenant farmers, and I'm sure we'll keep talking about this, because you do need the permission of the landowner. But where you can see mutual benefit, there hasn't been, in my experience with this project, any sort of difficulties there.
George, I want to spend the majority of the program focused on the positive aspects of natural capital markets, but at the same time, I think we do need to touch on one or two of the challenges. And I know that tenants that you've been working with have had a few issues in relation to solar. So without going into specific cases, where have these challenges particularly come from?
Yeah, so I think the problem here, Finlo, is that we are forced into a position of having to take what might be couched in linear programming terms as corner solutions due to the grid capacity and the structure of our electricity generation network. I mean, frankly, our grid connection network is not fit for purpose, and neither is it efficient to be transporting electricity over vast areas using underground and overground cables. But both these issues mean that we have developers looking to take large tracts of land out of agricultural use and into solar energy schemes to fit with that archaic network of grid connections. And the situation as between those who own the land and those who rent the land is, I suppose, a bit like the analysis of the English breakfast as between the pig and the chicken. You know, the chicken needs to make a contribution. It's the pig who has to make the sacrifice. And in this case, it's the tenant who's forced to sacrifice their business and their farming of the holding for a decision to allow a development which a landlord will invariably take advantage of. Now, although there's often talk about grazing between the panels with sheep, it's not really a realistic economic prospect for most tenant farmers. So yeah, that is a big issue for us.
I'm interested in the way in which we've discussed in the past in relation to solar farms, the way in which, from a farmer owner perspective, actually it can be a way of ensuring that that farm continues producing food because it is a guaranteed and constant income stream across the next 30 years once that's installed. And so if you've got, I don't know, 5%, 10% of your farm that's taken up with solar, then that's providing a guaranteed income stream, which then allows you to do something which is much more variable, in relation to food and fiber production. So I wonder if there are ways of tenant farmers being involved with solar in ways that benefit them in the same way. Are there ways of overcoming the challenges in relation to tenants and solar?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Finlo, if a tenant farmer was presented with a proposition by a landlord to take 5 or 10% of their land out of production into solar, and where there was a sharing of the benefits of that between the owner and the tenant farmers would be lining up to take those opportunities because it makes sense for them. But what we are seeing, sadly, is tenant farmers losing half or even more of their land to these schemes, and clearly that's got a massive impact on their businesses. And obviously, we need to be looking at better approaches more widely than land scale solar. So we should be looking at how we can use the roofs of agricultural buildings where we can put solar panels and make better use of balancing micro generation with the micro use of that energy rather than producing energy as a commodity, which is then sold into the grid. But in 2023, when in opposition, the Prime Minister did say that he wanted to expand the number of solar farms and to see a green energy revolution, but he was committed to ensuring that it would not be at the expense of tenant farmers, which he said needed to be assured that the soil beneath their feet was secure. Now, sadly, we've seen a number of decisions by the incoming Labour government which seem to have forgotten that promise in respect of some of those larger, naturally strategic, important projects and those where they've interfered in planning inspection. So we urgently need the government to address that. And in addition, if we do have to progress with larger scale schemes, I'm not naive to believe that we're going to be able not to have those larger scale schemes for the time being. Then we need to make sure that planners and inspectors and the government understand the need to take into consideration the personal circumstances of the tenant farmers involved, and that they're properly compensated for any land that is taken out of production. But hopefully into the long term, we can see a better approach where there's a mix of those smaller scale schemes you were talking about, rooftop solar, microgeneration, and local use of energy too.
And presumably a lot of that comes down to the way that the grid infrastructure is constructed at the moment, where it's still, to a large extent, I mean, not exclusively, but to a large extent, built on this kind of one to many basis, where one power station is supplying for many households and businesses in a particular location or region, as opposed to a many to many structure where you have lots and lots of different sorts of energy production, renewable energy production, that's then connecting for own use, for over the fence use, or then being sort of sold back into the grid.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been working with the likes of the Countryside Charity, the CPRE, to develop a policy around that more localized generation and use of energy, because it does make sense to move in the direction of renewable energy through the solar through the solar methodology. But the manner in which we have been left with a grid structure is not compatible with the sorts of aspirations we have for renewable energy, and that does need to change.
Obviously, Lucy, the way that tenant farming has grown up has been sort of focused around food and fibre production, but now we're seeing land uses around natural capital. So presumably there are opportunities for people to come in as new entrants, people like farmers who aren't necessarily using the land to produce food and fibre, but they are using it still as tenants to produce natural capital in some way. So I'm wondering about the difference between the natural capital market per se and the way that it uses land and the way that food and fibre uses land, and whether those opportunities differ fundamentally. Whether the opportunities between natural capital and more traditional sort of food and fibre production differ fundamentally from a tenant perspective.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would just start by saying that when I think about natural capital, when I'm describing it to people that I'm talking with, I would very much include food and fibre as part of that. Food, fibre, energy, timber, land for development. This is all part of the services and the value that we get from our land. It's just that now we recognize that amongst those services and the ones that we've been neglecting are carbon sequestration for climate regulation, biodiversity, maintaining a healthy biosphere, water regulation, etc. So it's not that those first things are not natural capital and we can just forget about them. We just need to expand that definition. But and so in many ways, they can be thought of similarly. Both cases are you're using land to create a product that is valued by a market, and it's by managing land in a certain way to achieve that outcome. However, there are differences, and natural capital tends to be more long-term and more uncertain, both in terms of what the market will pay, well, maybe what the market is in the first case. We've talked about hedgerow and is that going to be here, is it not, etc. So what the market is, what the market will pay, who the buyers will be, etc. You maybe would put more scrutiny into who your buyer is, what are their ultimate aims. A lot of clients that I work with will not work with or not sell carbon, for example, to a company who is not making sort of measurable, demonstrable progress towards a net zero target, because they don't want to be involved in any greenwashing, and that's quite right. So maybe there's a bit more scrutiny on the buyer side as well, but a lot more uncertainty. Whereas the food and fibre typically is shorter term, both in terms of actually generating that product and the income that comes from it is maybe more of an annual cycle. You might not see income from a natural capital project for several years after its implementation, unless you're getting a grant fund to sort of do it. But in terms of the actual private income stream from that can take a long time to come on. And the actual land use change can take a long time as well. So yeah, it's longer term, and it is currently more uncertain. And it's also, I guess, a permanent land use change. Obviously, if you're putting a woodland on a field, let's say, then that's something that is unlikely to be changed in the future. If you're restoring peatland, that's going to stay how it is, and you have to maintain it that way. So it's a permanent land use change. And because of all of those things, but particularly that last point, obviously tenant farmers will need the permission of the landowner, as we've said. And I think that's where we come into the tricky questions that we're coming to today about how to move that forwards.
Like part of this is about transparency and the access to the market itself and how easy it is to buy and sell things. As you say, if you're just to go back to George's analogy earlier on, if you've got a chicken and it's producing eggs, you can sell those eggs. You can stick them at the farm gates. You can go down to the village shop. You can sell them directly to customers if you want to, or you can sell them into, kind of grander, longer supply chains. Whereas if you're producing carbon within your soils, then you're having to work through intermediaries and third parties in order to make those sales, and that inherently is just more challenging, and I guess creates a greater level of administration and thought and strategy, which perhaps tenant farmers have not had to deal with in the more sort of traditional way of dealing with food production.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point around you'd have to go through intermediaries. That is definitely the current way it's working, but I wonder if that will always be the case. something that I think has a lot of potential in unlocking natural capital for tenant farmers is, as I said, farmer clusters, but farmers learning together. And the example of the Pentlands that I gave, they formed their own legal entity, so they in theory can be their own advocates, they can negotiate, they can trade, etc. So I don't think it necessarily has to always go through an intermediary, and I would hope that over time, as examples grow and confidence grows, that it can be much more farmer led. Of course, there are many reasons to go through an intermediary. You might have more successful negotiation, you might get better rates, have that expert knowledge. But yeah, it's something I would love to see farmers empowered to do themselves.
Interesting, because you've sort of taken that a couple of different angles on that. And the first is the idea of technology, I guess, in effect, a blockchain technology where farmers are able to sell directly through their computers or mobile phones. They're doing something, they can sell directly in that way. But also, then you were mentioning what reminded me of more traditional dairy cooperatives, where you have 50 different dairy farmers who are producing for a particular cooperative and they're taking responsibility for the sales. And I guess that would be a way of sort of regarding those sort of farm cluster approaches where you've got a number of farmers, they're all working in their own different way. They don't necessarily have the specialisms in terms of that sales technique, but they're able to rely on each other, rely on that sort of greater administrative body, the cooperative itself, to make the sales on their behalf.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really nice example. I mean, yeah, ultimately it's about learning together, and it's interesting at the moment. We've seen a real trend in the natural capital market for buyers valuing products that have these extra USPs beyond kind of just carbon. And one of them is, what is the social value that that project is delivering? What is it doing for rural economic development? What is it doing for farmers? And again, to go back to the Pentlands example, and I think it's probably true for the lens examples as well. I think the reason they've been successful is partly because buyers really like to see that it's doing good for farmers, and actually they really like the fact that it's them working together rather than just some person in a suit from Savills.
George, we're talking around this, but really it seems to me that landlord-tenant relationships are basically central to making this work.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just push back a little bit on what you said earlier, Finlo, about the split of where a tenant farmer and where a landlord sit in these marketplaces. I mean, one of the great benefits of the landlord tenant system in agriculture is it combines individuals who are asset rich but lack entrepreneurial flair with those who've got that entrepreneurial flair but lack the assets to go and do what they need to do to go farming. And I would suggest that it's those with the entrepreneurial flair that understand these markets better than those that don't have the entrepreneurial flair, but just simply have the assets. And I've certainly been involved in a number of discussions where a landlord has come forward with what looks like a whiz-bang idea for one of these nascent markets, and it's clearly too good to be true because it is too good to be true. And because the landlord's been, duped into some sort of arrangement that he thinks is going to be really great for the land. So I think actually a better collegiate cooperative relationship between landlord and tenant here can work really well. So it's 100% the case that that there's a role here for facilitating those better relationships, and there's a role here too for agents, speaking to Lucy here from Savills, they need to provide a facilitating role rather than quite often what we see as a blocking role. Most private landlords, as I say, aren't professionals. They aren't entrepreneurs. They happen to have an asset that that they're fortunate enough to have, and they want to be really careful about making sure they don't put themselves into positions where that could cause them a problem, and therefore they rely heavily on the advice that they are receiving. And if that advice tends to be quite conservative and quite restrictive and its approach and quite backward looking, that it can lead to potential projects being stifled and those opportunities for landlords consent not to be given. It's a bit like health and safety. Health and safety is important, but you can go over the top and it can stifle everything. We wouldn't get out of bed in the morning if we went to the nth degree on that. And sometimes that's a bit how it feels with land agents when they're advising their private clients. And equally, we need landlords and their agents to take a measured approach and a proportionate approach to the risk to allow these collaborative agreements. But yeah, it is all about relationships and making sure that there is collaboration, there is clarity, and there is communication.
I think another thing, another trap perhaps that I've fallen into, and I think we have within this podcast, is the idea that tenant farmers and farmer landowners, that they're entirely different entities. Because of course there's a big sort of section in the middle of the Venn diagram, isn't there, where you've got people who own their own farms, but they are also tenants as well, and so the landscape becomes really quite complicated. And in that way, again, I'm sort of coming back to the degree to which those opportunities exist on a direct tenant landowner relationship, George, or the degree to which we need to have sort of larger, more landscape focused approaches where there are a number of different farming entities, whether they're tenants or landowners, within a particular landscape scale approach with a shared vision, so that everybody within that landscape, or the majority, can buy into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, we've got tenant farmers that we work with day in and day out who are large owner occupiers as well as large tenant farmers. We've got individuals who let their land out as well as let land in, depending on how it works for them strategically. So yeah, it really is a blend there. And I think there's a real mistake here for us to be thinking about these contracts being between the owners of the land and the people who wish to see those natural capital benefits. We need to develop these tripartite arrangements between owners, those in the marketplace looking for the benefits, and tenant farmers who are managing that land, and also others, contract farmers, graziers, common land rights holders. There's a plethora of ways in which you access land that we just need to build into the thinking, so it's not just a one-on-one relationship.
So as part of the challenge, that this is, frankly, it's a really new area. It's a new set of markets for farmers to be able to work into, where food and fiber production, where there's been success, where there hasn't been success, there's a tremendous diversity within those markets across Britain, because they've existed for centuries and they've developed in different ways. So what we're talking about here is latching in a new set of markets within this old traditional existing market. And what we really need is a much greater level of diversification.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, these are not like just selling eggs to a consumer. That this is about having to navigate your way through some complicated legal agreements and long-term agreements. So we're talking about agreements that can last 30, 40, 50 years here. So this isn't just a single transaction on a single day of the week. And inevitably that will bring with it greater levels of complication. And there could be a number of land occupiers through that 30-year or 40-year time frame that you need to build into that thinking. So yeah, it does require a greater degree of imagination and skill in bringing that together. But we shouldn't do ourselves down. We have the ability to put these things together, and we should work at it.
What do you think can be done to improve or support that landlord-tenant relationship to ensure mutual benefit in relation to these natural capital markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think George made some really good points around risk, and perhaps there is quite a lot of aversion to risk in the market. I'm quite lucky that sort of by the time I get to speak to people, they're quite open-minded about natural capital, and I get to play that facilitation role. But I totally hear you. It's, we work in quite a traditional sector, and there is quite a lot of preference of the status quo. I think from the start, you need to start from the point of why it's an opportunity worth pursuing, why change. And so from the tenant's perspective, from the landlord's perspective, is it about reducing risk, diversifying income, a passion for wildlife? What is it? And are you on the same page about that? You might not be, but that's okay. Starting from why, and then have transparent communication based on that. It's really important to discuss upfront what the benefits are for each party. The landlord can't necessarily do it without the tenant, and vice versa. So open communications about that risk, the responsibility, who's going to do what, when, who carries that risk, and then the upside. Well, how might an income be shared? What's the benefit for both parties as well? And as you say, it's a long-term thing, so you might not necessarily have all the answers we don't know what's going to happen in 40 years' time. We weren't talking about carbon credits 40 years ago. It would be naive to assume we know what natural capital markets are going to be doing in even 20 years' time, let's be honest. So just having those really open and clear lines of communication, I think, is the number one place to start. And I know that's a lot easier said than done.
In terms of reducing that risk, you've talked there about the way that you sort of form relationships, form contracts in the first instance. I wonder, within those contracts, whether there are particular legal mechanisms that can support good relationships going forwards, or reduce the risk in case those relationships start to break down.
So I think it's an area that does need innovation, and we do need more creative solutions. But a couple of examples come to mind. So the first would be environmental farm business tenancies, or EFBT. So a specific type of agricultural tenancy designed to support food production and nature recovery, and providing a framework for the tenant in which to do that. So it might be a longer term agreement, so maybe 15 years, providing some of that security, although they don't always align very well with sort of, as you say, like the 30+ year agreements for natural capital. So that's something that can be improved. But a key part is that there's a portion of the land dedicated to environmental management, so 15%. And I think the Crown Estate has worked with the TFA on this. So George, you might have more to say about them. And then just another example, which is much newer, but we've worked with some institutional landowners on how to help fund the environmental transition on their tenant farms. And obviously that's not possible for all landowners, but going back to right at the beginning, George said some of the institutional ones are perhaps being a bit more progressive in this. And I think we need, a rising tide lifts all boats. So let's have those innovators first. So we've been working through with them how to fund this transition. And I think a key question is whether to fund outcomes or action. So most natural capital markets currently fund outcomes. So I will buy X amounts of carbon credits from you. This works with buyers and sellers because you can only sell what you have, unless you're selling PIUs, but we probably won't get into that. But I'm quite interested in funding actions, and I think this can be a really interesting legal mechanism for supporting natural capital and tenant farming situations. So this might be, I don't know, let's say a change or a delay in your mowing patterns. Then the outcome is measured from that action. So increased soil carbon storage or better success rates for ground nesting birds. The key thing is then to learn from what the outcome was and adjust practices based on that. The reason I'm quite interested in this model of funding is that it allows that flexibility and that adaptability depending on the farm, depending on the farmer, depending on the current tenancy and that relationship, and enables us to respond to how nature reacts, because we know nature is complex, it's sometimes unpredictable, especially in the changing climate that we already have. So it helps to de-risk that environmental transition for the farmer, rather than locking into a particular project on an assumption that it might deliver a particular outcome that we might then get paid for. So that's something that I don't think has really been done at scale yet, but I would be really interested to see people trying that out.
It's interesting. I mean, there are various different natural capital markets that I can see that working within. But if we think of BNG, for example, biodiversity net gain, then at that point, you're looking at a 30-year agreement where there are key outcomes that have been agreed in advance. But then it's about putting in place a management program, isn't it? So at that point, it is about actions. It's about things that get done in order to deliver and work towards that 30-year goal at the end of it. And there's no reason why that needs to be delivered by a landowner or a tenant, or it could be a combination of both. But basically, whoever is working that land would need to manage their actions within those constraints.
Yeah, so there are particular markets, and BNG is a great example where it's a statutory market, you do need a particular outcome, and that's really important. So what I'm thinking about is more in that voluntary side of things, or in the supply chain. So going back to sort of the example of like Nestle Diageo funding their supply chain to do this, they might want to see reduced input into the farming system overall in their supply chain. What that will look like will depend on each different farm, so they can then sort of adjust their actions based on that. So there are some markets where you definitely need outcomes-based payments, but then there's some that I think the actions could work just as well, if not better.
Yeah, interesting. George, do you want to just come back in before we go to a break on the Crown Estate?
Yeah, Lucy alluded to the work that we've been doing with the Crown Estate, and it's a really interesting example, because it wasn't that long ago that the Crown Estate was selling its agricultural land, and I was sat across tables of the leadership of the Crown Estate in those days, where they were referring to their agricultural estate as a vanilla asset. It wasn't very interesting. It wasn't doing much for them, so they were going to divest themselves of their farming land. But now they've really fallen back in love with their estates, which is really good news, and principally because of those total return issues that we've been talking about today, and the extent to which that land can really deliver for the nation in terms of natural capital. And the Crown Estate came to me just over a year ago, I think it was, with a first draft of an EFBT agreement that they were thinking about running out, and they thought they'd done a good job in pulling it together. And I think they were on version 5 of their draft. And over the year, we've negotiated various terms and bits and pieces, and we've got to draft 15 of that agreement. And the Crown Estate is about to jointly launch that with us at a conference we're holding in Windsor in May. So I think that's a major step forward, and it's about security of tenure. It's about providing cooperation. It's about being clear at the beginning of the agreement what it is you want to achieve, but setting reasonable parameters within which to give you flexibility to flex what you're doing, both from a total return perspective with natural capital, but also with diversification, bringing in other income streams as well as natural capital, how you share those benefits as between the landlord and the tenant. It's being trialed at the moment on the Crown Estate's Devizes estate in Wiltshire, and also down in Romney Marsh in Kent. So we're really excited about seeing how that develops, and the Crown Estate is particularly keen to be a bit of a beacon. Lucy was talking about how you bring other bits of the system in, and the Crown Estate wants to be open-handed and to share what it's done on its EFBT agreement, to bring it into a wider premise. And we've also seen, just alluding to others, the church commissioners have come forward in recent years with a better program for working with tenant farmers on this agenda. It wasn't long ago. I would describe the church commissioners as a glorified pension fund in a way in which it handled its agricultural land, but it's certainly in a much better place now. And also agents like the Duchy of Lancaster, National Trust, who you might have expected should have been up there in the first place, they are beginning to emerge as an interesting force. And the Duchy of Cornwall has always been interested in this, but perhaps it's been overtaken a little bit by the Crown. So it might help them to bring things forward. So there's a lot of good work going on, ffinlo, and we're very, very keen to work with whatever landlords there are out there who want to progress this agenda.
George, I'm fascinated in what you're talking about there in relation to those large estates and your experience. And I'm interested as well in the way that, those relationships have changed over time. But I think that's a different podcast. And maybe you and I can come back and we can have a conversation about that.
Absolutely.
It feels like there's an hour's worth of conversation right there. Lucy, the length of contracts is clearly an issue. Farm tenancies are often just a few years, while natural capital delivery tends to be over decades. I know that we started talking about this, but I wonder if we can get into it in a bit more detail. Are there ways to overcome this challenge specifically?
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer to this question other than it does need to change. And so I would hope...
right, let's move on. No,
maybe it's just as simple as that. So some of the examples that we've given, EFBTs, slightly longer term, I think there's so much potential there. So I'm really looking forward to that May announcement, George. I think that'd be really sort of groundbreaking. I think we just need to get more comfortable with creating long-term farm tenancies, and whether that comfort needs to come on the side of the landlord or the tenant, I'm not sure. George would probably have an opinion on that. I think I think that would go a long way to encouraging more people into the tenant farming sector as well, and providing that greater certainty, which needs to be there regardless of natural capital anyway. One specific sort of thought I had around markets for this is potentially the biodiversity market. So, and I'm talking about the voluntary biodiversity market. So we've talked a lot about carbon, and because it takes a while for a landscape to change, to sequester that carbon, particularly if it's a woodland, but even, peatland, it takes a while for that income stream to come on, and so that's why the contracts are long term. Biodiversity markets are evolving, and we sort of remain to see exactly how they're going to function, but generally it's a payment for changing and maintaining a particular habitat and landscape. So actually it could be more of a cyclical payment, and as long as that habitat is being maintained, there can be income received. So that could potentially work on a shorter term cycle as well. And then, of course, there's soil carbon. And I think I'm always a bit cynical about soil carbon. I think there's been quite a lot said about it, and it hasn't quite come to fruition, but that doesn't mean it's not going to. I'm just always cautious about sort of hyping it up too much. But again, soil carbon could be more of that annual payment where the interventions and the way that you're managing your land on an annual basis sort of accrue carbon in the soil, and you get paid for that. So I think, as well as we just need to get more comfortable with those longer tenancies, the markets in general, some of them are always going to be long term because that's just the way that the sort of climate carbon sequestration happens. But others can be on that more cyclical basis, and I think they hold great promise.
George, I wonder if you could come in and talk about that whole sort of issue of actions versus outcomes, and in the context perhaps of a scheme, a natural capital delivery scheme, which is going to last for 30 years, maybe even it's going to be there for 80 years, depending on the length of the contract. But you've got tenants that are coming in with tenancy arrangements of 5 or 10 years, or perhaps less than that again. How can they get involved in this? How can they earn some benefit from it? And is that around actions?
Yeah, so I think it's about being clear at the get-go as to what it is you want to achieve. And we have certainly been in conversations on private estates where those private estates have wanted to dip their toes in the water of some markets, or to develop some natural capital benefits on their holdings, and they've talked about how they might build that into the drafting of tenancy agreements. And alluding back to what we said earlier, and Lucy agreed that it is a relatively conservative industry within which we're operating, and getting people to think about the sorts of clauses that you need to draw up so that they cover both the responsibility and the benefits of those things is quite a challenge. But we are getting there, and I've certainly been involved in discussions between private landlords and tenant farmers where we've built in some of these clauses into agreements. And tenants are there for such a time as this. They're not going to be there forever. And so long as they can see that they are getting a return for their labor, their capital, their investment, their risk along the way as an income, then they are very much keen to be involved in it. Where they get a bit shirty is where the landlord wants to keep all of that for themselves, and the agreement says you shall do this, you shall do that, you shan't do this, you shan't do that, and the tenant says, well, how do I make a living then if that's the framework within which we're operating? So I do think that we are at a point where we are seeing more situations emerging where landlords and tenants are working collaboratively through those sorts of those agreements, but we need the likes of the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, the Royal Association of Chartered Surveyors, and the Agricultural Law Association to think about developing the frameworks around which these agreements can be brought into fruition.
I'm interested in the way that, when we've had conversations in the past, we've talked about the way that landlords and land agents are very good at really understanding the legislative landscape, the funding landscape, and ensuring that they are always in the best position to, to take a decent slice of the money that's available for the farming on a particular segment of land. And I wonder how we mitigate against that when we think of, for example, Wild Fund has a relationship now with various water companies across Britain where farmers who are farming in the Wild Fund way are being paid on a sort of annual basis, essentially for actions to reduce the nutrient loading that goes into the watershed. And so it's those individual farmers, whether they're tenants or landowners or whatever, who are undertaking the actions, who should be getting the benefit of the money that's being paid by those water companies. Is there a danger that landlords will find a way of siphoning that money off themselves in some way? And how can we mitigate against it?
Well, I mean that sadly has been the way in which we have seen these discussions going on traditionally. I think we are now beginning to see, if I can use the phrase, the glass ceiling break a little bit, so that there is much more opportunity for people to be collegiate. But it's not just about the tenant farmers being like mute laborers providing this action. They are really important people with their own knowledge of the landscapes within which they're operating, what will work within those landscapes, and the risks of doing things. So, for example, we've got members who are worried about rewilding because of wildfire issues, and needing to to de-risk that aspect within landscapes. I mean, we're seeing already this year, we haven't had many dry days, but already we're seeing the wildfire issue coming up the agenda. And we could see natural capital going up in smoke pretty quickly if we don't think about those things in a holistic way. So I think it's really important not just to see tenant farmers as your laborers in this marketplace. It's about them being part and parcel of developing, designing, and delivering really good schemes and sharing that risk. So yeah, we are beginning to see many more situations where that's becoming a factor, but we need to see many more.
I guess the truth is that tenant farmers, just like other farmers, are human beings. And so you will have some who are more comfortable in that sort of action space where they are effectively laboring against a particular set of criteria, and others who are the innovators who want to come in with new ideas and do exciting things. And it's making sure there are opportunities for both and everyone in between, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the real issues come when you drive a wedge between the landlord and the tenant. So the landlord in some ways considers that the tenant has no part to play in the design of these things, and the tenant
I see
feels
what you mean. Yeah.
disenfranchised by the whole process and just gets told you're going to do X or Y. And even if there is a financial return to that, I've spoken to many tenants who say, well, I don't think it's morally right to take that money because we aren't delivering what we should be delivering. It's not right for the environment within which we're farming. So I don't want to take that money because I think it's wrong. So it is about bringing all parties and all minds to the party, if you like, and to ensure that we are doing the right thing by the environment, that we don't create vanity schemes which create money but deliver nothing, which sadly we have seen in the country in certain places.
I guess part of that is about whether it's a new tenancy or whether it's a transition or a changing element,
Yeah.
changing parts of the agreement for existing tenancies, isn't it? And if you're effectively a farmer owner or landowner of another kind who is recruiting a farmer to come in and manage land in a particular way, that's really different from managing a relationship with a tenant that's been on that land for a decade or for 5 decades prior to that.
Absolutely, and also there's a sort of the daily issues that a tenant faces. There's no point in the landlord coming to talk to a tenant about natural capital if they've got a roof with a hole in it, where the landlord hasn't invested in the basic needs of the farm to make sure that it's a habitable and safe place to work. So there are many situations where tenant farmers haven't seen a pick of money spent on repairs by their estates for donkey's years, and then all of a sudden a whiz bang scheme for natural capital comes along, and you think, well, hang on a minute, what about my leaking roof? So we need to get the business as usual operating well as well.
Really interesting. Lots of natural capital delivery, of course, happens at landscape scale, and we've talked about the Pentland scheme and one or two other sort of cluster examples. But are you aware of examples, George, of where landlords and owners and tenants are all working together constructively to deliver that landscape recovery? And could you talk us through one or two of them?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot already about the Crown Estate and how that's going to be rolled out later this year, and I think that's really exciting. We've seen DEFRA relook at the way in which it's delivering its landscape recovery scheme, which has been involving estates over large areas where perhaps tenant farmers have been either forgotten or forced to be dragged into a scheme without being properly consulted. And we're now seeing lots of those schemes now readdressing and refocusing the need on collegiality. And as I said as well, we've got a number of individual landlords who are part of a landscape scale scheme where they are talking to their tenants about how they can be part and parcel of what's going on at a landscape scale, but just through the conduit of their individual farms. So yeah, we are seeing some new and innovative ways forward, but they are still the minority, not the majority.
Lucy, I think there is often an assumption that natural capital markets, and we've been discussing this to an extent already, that they're for landowners rather than for tenants. Are there ways of changing that perception and helping farmers more broadly to understand nature markets, helping nature market companies within those nature markets understand the needs of tenants?
So if you look at the way that natural capital markets have evolved, that they have suited large single landowners because they have the scale, the autonomy, and perhaps the ability to take a risk to make that permanent land use change and to experiment. But this is changing, and we've talked about a lot of examples today of how that's changing. There's going to be still that need for landscape scale, but there's also going to be businesses and organizations who are interested in funding smaller scale projects as well. I mean, an example that we haven't discussed is compensatory planting. So if we look at all this sort of energy infrastructure that's going in across the UK, and I know George talked about that earlier, there's often a need for compensatory planting or compensatory peatland restoration. That's often like 60 hectares. And I know that obviously that's still quite large, but that isn't where the market sort of started from, looking at sort of hundreds and hundreds of hectares.
Sorry, just tell us what you mean by compensatory.
Okay, so a really simple example would be I'm Scottish Power and I'm putting in a transmission line across a certain area, and I have to take out a bunch of woodland to do that. I need to compensate for that lost woodland, and it might add up to not that much hectareage, and so I need to do that often within the same local authority, but not always. And again, often with sort of native woodland planting as well, and that's something that the tenant or the landlord can get paid for. So yeah, I think we have examples, and these examples can help a lot with changing this perception. It's so much better, I think, for farmers, as I've said before, to sort of learn from each other about what works and what doesn't work, as long as they also know where to go if there is a knowledge gap. So yeah, we need to get better at shining a light on how tenants have gotten involved in natural capital so far and learn from it, sort of warts and all, not that open hand that George talked about, not sharing, not hiding away from where it's been, maybe it didn't work.
George, I wonder if you could sort of comment on whether you think that there is actually a challenge in terms of helping tenant farmers to understand that natural capital markets are for them as much as for landowners. And obviously we've talked about, there's a huge range of different human being that is also a tenant farmer, a whole range of different sorts of tenancies. But do you think there is a tendency within the tenant farmer community to think, this is something I need to be wary of, rather than seeing it as an opportunity?
Yeah, I do think that we have developed an ethos here where tenant farmers are more wary than they are open, because of the way in which these things have been presented to them by the landlord community or by the land agency community. And it's almost like they're being talked about outside of the room that they're in. And the more that we can bring tenant farmers into that room and have those discussions, the better, in my view, because as I said earlier, the conversations that I have with tenant farmers every day of the week, they have a love for, a passion for, an enthusiasm for the natural environments within which they're operating. They can see where benefits can accrue. They can see where improvements can be made. And they just want to be part of the conversation. They want to be part of the discussion from the floor up. They don't want to be dropped upon at a mighty height when a scheme has already been well developed, where they think, well, hang on a minute, this isn't going to work for my landscape. And the more that we can be inclusive about those discussions, the better. So I don't think that there's a problem in relation to tenant farmers wishing to be involved. I think they just see that they are disenfranchised, and that the more that we can enfranchise them in those discussions, the better.
Lucy, when we spoke before, you mentioned the Scottish crofting community. I wonder if there are things that you think that we can learn from that crofting community.
Yeah, so obviously crofting communities, crofting law are complex and unique in their own rights. But I do think there's some comparisons to be made, because again, it comes back to that thing where the landlord or landowner and the crofter or the tenant have to work together in this market. So, and it's been really interesting to see how this community has started to embrace natural capital, particularly peatland restoration in the north of Scotland, where there's a significant crofting community. So a great example would be the Flow Country Partnership. So this is a collaboration between crofters, landowners, and local businesses, again, to protect and restore the Flow Country, which is the most extensive blanket bog system in the world. So crofters play a vital role in this, because they're the land managers. So by implementing those sustainable land management practices, such as controlled grazing, re-wetting, peatland restoration, etc. They sort of hold the keys to being able to protect and restore that natural environment. And it's really interesting, George, sort of, people being in the room. I think in this example, I don't want to speak for them, but from what I can tell, it feels like that community has been able to take a lot of that power because they are the land managers, because they are the people on the ground. It won't happen without them. So it's really interesting to think about those power dynamics and who should be in the room, and perhaps historically who hasn't been in the room. And I think that's something that we need to correct.
Really interesting. Thank you. George, we're coming towards the end of the programme, and I just wonder if you could talk us through things that you might need from government to ensure access to natural capital markets for tenant farmers in relation to frameworks or incentives.
Yeah, Ffinlo, there's a number of things that I think that governments could do, and without wanting to get too political, I mean, let's look at the inheritance tax situation first. I mean, landlords who are offering tenants long-term secure agreements with flexibility around natural capital deserve to be incentivized through the inheritance tax process to ensure that they're not going to be hammered for inheritance tax on those opportunities. Those who are offering shorter term agreements, yeah, you could argue fair enough, the inheritance tax should apply, but given the natural capital benefits that would accrue to the nation from those long-term agreements, I think the Chancellor needs to think again about what she has said in relation to those types of agreements. Also, we've got the definition of agriculture. It was written back in the 1940s, which is still part and parcel of both the pieces of legislation in England and also in Scotland, as England, Wales, and Scotland. We could do with having a full review of the definition of agriculture to widen it to include some of these natural capital issues, and the rules of good husbandry which go along with it. The rules of good husbandry still require us to have short, neat hedgerows, for example. So we need to review those to make sure we're not creating unintended situations here. And we've also in England, we've recently had the code of good practice for the way in which landlords and tenants should operate to try and embrace some of these markets as well. We've got the role of the tenant farming commissioner coming in England. We already have one in Scotland who's been doing some good work here, and there's certainly more work that could be done to encourage the sort of communication and collaboration and clarity that we need for these markets through the commissioner. And a final one is around unreasonable behaviour. And we have within some of the tenancy legislation the ability for tenants to object to their landlord's unreasonable refusal to allow them to access government financial assistance schemes. Well, why don't we have similar legislation which allows tenants to object to the landlord's unreasonable refusal to allow them to take part in these sorts of natural capital markets, which clearly has a much more wider public benefit. So there's a number of areas in which government could facilitate and provide a better framework for these discussions to take place.
So it sounds to me like what you're talking about there is government having a better understanding of land use and how it sort of fits within existing tax schemes or new policies that they're bringing in and the impacts that changes in those policies have, but then specifically making sure that they understand and think about tenant farmers and their unique circumstances within those legislative frameworks and incentives themselves as well. Lucy, what do you think the market itself should be doing differently or better in order that natural capital opportunities become more accessible for tenant farmers?
So I think in the same way we've talked about on the seller side, there's a lot of uncertainty in sort of learning by doing and everyone sort of trying to figure things out. That's true on the market side as well. Like businesses are sort of scrambling to catch up. What does this all mean and how does it work and what are the risks for us? So it's on both sides. So I think there's a lot of learning they can do and being open to alternative financing models and complexity, not being put off by the fact that it might be a farmer cluster or it might be a smaller scale project. They can themselves aggregate, let's say, take the easy example of carbon emissions. They might have X number of tons per year that they need to offset. They don't have to do that all in one scheme. They can aggregate projects as well. And that might provide them with a more diversified portfolio, de-risking their projects as well, de-risking that investment. So being open to those alternative models, being open to complexity, supporting farm clusters, so looking into things like lens. And then I guess finally, just actively recruiting tenants. So letting them know that these opportunities are available to them and maybe they could say, we are specifically seeking farming tenants, we want to partner with you rather than a landlord. I don't think that's really happened to date. And I think if they could do that sort of active promotion, that would really help.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. Thanks so much, both of you. That is sadly all we have time for. In the next episode of Filling the Funding Gap, we'll look at how finance can help farmers to unlock nature. In the next episode of Filling the Funding Gap, we'll look at how finance can help farmers to unlock nature markets. In the meantime, the second episode in our new Leaders series is available, this time featuring Tim Coates, the co-founder of Oxbury Bank. For now, I'd like to thank my guests, Lucy Jenner from Savills and George Dunn from the Tenant Farmers Association. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate's Filling the Funding Gap series is sponsored by Barclays, Environment Bank, Forest Carbon, Howden Insurance Brokers, Regenerate and Safri. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.